On science, space, and technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today, we meet to consider H.R. 6076, the To Research, Evaluate, Assess, and Treat Astronauts Act, otherwise known as TREAT, is the acronym. H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016, and H.R. 5829, the Advise Now Act. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. The first bill, H.R. 6076, the Treat Astronauts Act, establishes an occupational health care and enhanced monitoring program for former American astronauts. This bill ensures that our courageous men and women who venture into space receive support for medical issues associated with their service. It also allows NASA to get more data on the effects of human spaceflight. I thank Space Subcommittee Chairman Brian Babin for introducing this first-of-its-kind legislation. Since NASA selected the first group of astronauts in 1959, more than 300 American astronauts have ventured into the cosmos as explorers. In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook how dangerous it is and how little we know about the long-term health effects of spaceflight. Today, through its lifetime surveillance of astronaut health program, NASA screens and monitors astronauts for occupational-related injury or disease. This program contributes to our scientific knowledge of long-term health effects and assists participating astronauts in monitoring for spaceflight-related illnesses and disease. However, this program does not provide for diagnosis or treatment of those no longer serving. It also does not include retired and management astronauts because NASA is not explicitly authorized to provide such services. Current astronauts receive full medical treatment. Former astronauts benefit from the Federal Employee Claims Act, and ex-military astronauts are afforded even more services. This legislation will fill any gaps to ensure that our country fulfills its obligation to care for medical conditions that may be associated with human spaceflight. Filling those gaps for former astronauts will encourage their expanded participation in the Data Research, Evaluation, and Assessment Program. The Treat Astronauts Act is also fiscally responsible. It establishes NASA as a secondary payer to existing obligations of the United States or any third party. I again thank Chairman Babin and urge my colleagues to support the Treat Astronauts Act. The second bill we will consider this afternoon is H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016. I thank the sponsor, Congressman Ralph Abraham, for taking the initiative on this legislation. During this Congress, the Science Committee has held close to a dozen hearings related to oversight, policy, and budgetary aspects of federal cybersecurity issues. The hearings included the examination of data breaches at the Office of Personnel Management, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. These hearings have underscored a need for accountability, responsibility, and transparency within these agencies and within the federal government as a whole relative to the cybersecurity of information and information systems. The Science Committee's jurisdiction over the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has broad and meaningful potential for improvement of federal government IT security. The Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002 and the Federal Information Security Modernization of 2014 task NIST with establishing cybersecurity standards, guidelines, and associated methods and techniques for use by the federal government through research and development. The hearings held by this committee have identified several shortcomings by agencies in fulfilling FISMA requirements. Dr. Abraham's bill serves an important purpose and addresses these shortcomings through more research, agency head accountability, and Office of Management and Budget Enforcement. And I thank Dr. Abraham for his work and urge my colleagues to support H.R. 6066. Now, the final bill we will consider is H.R. 5829, the Advise Now Act. This bill requires the EPA to finally create an already authorized Agriculture Committee to its Science Advisory Board within 30 days of enactment. If the EPA fails to meet the deadline, the authority is transferred to the Secretary of Agriculture, who then has 15 days to appoint members of the EPA SAB Agriculture Committee. The establishment of the EPA Agricultural Science Committee will provide farmers with an important and strong voice in the federal rulemaking process and gives them a seat at the table. The EPA has a history of advancing regulations that impact the agricultural community without proper input from those who are directly affected by the EPA's regulations. The Advise Now Act is an important first step to help remedy this situation. I thank my colleagues on the Agricultural Committee Chairman Michael Conaway and Congressman Rodney Davis for their work on this bill, and I support it and urge my colleagues to support it as well. Committee approval of these three bills will advance America's future security through increased space activity, hardened information infrastructure, and an expanding food supply. And that concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, is recognized for hers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may add that is at the conclusion of my statement, I need to leave for a few minutes, but I will return. Let me thank you for today's markup of three bills. H.R. 6067, the Treat Astronauts Act, H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016, and H.R. 2829, the Advise Now Act. The first bill, the Treat Astronauts Act, is a good bill, and I support it. Chairman Smith and Chairman Babbitt worked with Ranking Member Edwards to arrive at legislative language we can all support. I also note that NASA is supportive of this legislation. If we want to send astronauts to far-flung destinations like Mars, we need to understand the long-term implications of space travel on human health. This bill will help NASA to understand those issues and hopefully one day get humans safely to Mars and back home. We're also marking up H.R. 5829. While there's nothing offensive about this bill, I can't really find much positive to say about it either. The bill appears to be duplicative with the language already in law, and my understanding from staff is that the whole bill will moot the 2 weeks when EPA SAB announces the membership of the committee in question. The third bill we are marking up today is H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016. I really want to be clear here. This bill is nothing more than a legislative window dressing for the majority's myriad cybersecurity investigations into agencies outside the committee's jurisdiction. This has culminated in unprecedented investigations into practices of a current major party nominee for president. Why do I call it simply window dressing? First, we have done none of the normal committee activities to perfect this bill. We have held no legislative hearings, no subcommittee markup. We have not solicited or received any feedback or advice from any cybersecurity experts or any of the agencies mentioned in the bill. And quite frankly, it shows in the sloppy work before us today. Portions of this bill reads really nonsensibly. Some provisions might be unconstitutional. Other provisions seems to be inadvertently place DoD cybersecurity standards under the control of NIST, a civilian agency. One would think that if the majority really takes cybersecurity so seriously, they would have done the basic work to ensure that the bill made sense. But I suspect this bill is less about improving cybersecurity and more about bolstering the case for the chairman's investigation into former Secretary Clinton's email practices. That can be seen in the bill text itself. Page 9 of the bill references that agency head should not use a private messaging software or private email service for official communications. This is a transparent reference to the case of former Secretary Clinton. To date, the chairman has issued 6 subpoenas in this Clinton email investigation, including one just yesterday to the director of the FBI. And I might add, to what end? There have always been investigations by the State Department. Many of investigations have been done. The FBI, the $7 million Benghazi Committee, the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and most recently, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. What is the Science Committee going to uncover that all of these other investigations have not? I think it needs to be said that the majority's investigation of Secretary Clinton's email arrangement is an embarrassment and a stain on this committee. We should not be using the oversight powers of this committee, much less significant taxpayers' dollars, to engage in transparently partisan activities. I look forward to the day when the Science Committee gets back to the subject of science and stopped acting as an opposition research arm to the Donald Trump campaign. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Let me say it sounds like maybe we're on the same page for 2 out of 3. In regard to the third, to my knowledge, it has nothing to do with former Secretary Clinton. It has to do with the FDIC, but thanks for the idea. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6076, the To Research, Evaluate, Assess, and Treat Astronauts Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 6076, a bill to require the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to
Without
establish a
objection, the
program.
bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and the sponsor of the bill, Subcommittee Chairman Brian Babin, will be recognized for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For over 50 years, the United States of America has asked its bravest to travel in space in service to their country. From the dynamic launch environment to the unforgiving vacuum of space to the energetic reentry of Earth, human spaceflight places astronauts in very challenging environments. Even training for spaceflight carries significant risks. I'm proud to say that I represent a great number of these astronauts who call the Houston area home. As a nation, we have obligations to those that we put in harm's way. As a Congress, we have a responsibility to provide for the treatment of the conditions caused by federal service. As a healthcare professional myself and as a representative, you could say that it's my duty to make sure that these folks are taken care of properly. And that's why I've sponsored H.R. 6076, the TREAT Act, a common-sense, fiscally responsible, bipartisan bill that makes sure that our brave men and women that venture into space receive support for medical issues associated with that service. I'm very glad that my colleague, Mrs. Edwards, is a sponsor of this bill, and I hope for broad bipartisan support. In developing this bill, my staff and I had extensive discussions with former astronauts, NASA, and a number of other federal agencies. The TREAT Act is also informed by a hearing the Space Subcommittee held back in June, at which a number of former astronauts testified, including Captain Scott Kelly. Under existing statutes, NASA has the authority to collect voluntary astronaut medical data for research and exercises that authority through the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health Program, or LSAH. However, there are limitations on the usefulness of the LSAH program. Former astronaut participation is only 61%. And the existing LSAH program only affords NASA access to yearly checkup data, not the entirety of the former astronauts' medical records. Furthermore, NASA is unable to provide for the appropriate diagnosis and treatment under the existing authority to conduct research. The TREAT Act solves this problem. The TREAT Act establishes an occupational health care program for former American astronauts, ensuring that they receive support for medical issues associated with their service, and to further the scientific understanding of human spaceflight itself. In discussions with former astronauts, the need to have access to local service providers was identified as a concern. Former astronauts may not be able to or may not be willing to travel to a NASA center, such as Johnson Space Center, to receive program services. In order to facilitate broader participation in the program, the bill provides for local medical practitioners to administrate monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment. NASA has a legitimate scientific need for psychological or medical data associated with an astronaut's human spaceflight service. The additional data acquired under the program established by this bill will enable NASA to better understand the medical risks of space flight minimize these risks, and enable future long-duration missions to Mars and even beyond. It would be irresponsible for Congress not to ensure the TREAT Act is fiscally responsible. In order to prevent unknown cost risks associated with the program, the bill qualifies that the program is not authorized until a number of reports and an independent cost estimate is delivered to Congress. Authorization is revoked in the event NASA fails to deliver annual reports on the status of the program. Furthermore, the bill only provides for funding to the extent provided in advance by appropriations. And while the bill sunsets the program after 10 years, it also allows for astronauts currently in the program to continue receiving treatment. It is our intent that this program be reauthorized after 10 years. The sunset simply allows Congress the opportunity to revisit, potentially update, and refine the program if necessary. The bill establishes NASA as a secondary payer to existing obligations of the United States or third parties, ensuring that the cost to NASA is minimized. Establishing NASA as a secondary payer is not unprecedented. For example, the Department of Defense is a secondary payer to certain types of veteran and civilian health care programs. Participation in the program is voluntary. No astronaut should be forced or coerced to participate in this program. In the event an astronaut chooses not to participate in the program, there are still other occupational health care options available to them. Existing NASA authorities provide active duty astronauts with comprehensive occupational health care, and there is not a need to include them in the program. Existing authorities also allow NASA to incorporate and use existing data and data collected from flight assignable astronauts with any data collected under the program. In conclusion, I strongly support the TREAT Act, and I urge my colleagues to support this common sense, fiscally responsible, bipartisan bill that makes sure that our brave men and women that venture into space receive the support for medical issues associated with their service and that they deserve. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Babin. We will now proceed with amendments to the bill, and we have one listed, and that will be offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6076, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland, amendment number 056, page 9, after line 21.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also to our subcommittee chairman, Mr. Babin. Today, we're continuing what I believe are strong bipartisan efforts to further our goals for space exploration. The House passed bipartisan NASA Authorization Act of 2015 actually set the long-term goal of sending humans to the surface of Mars. The Treat Astronauts Act puts in place an important element in achieving this goal. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff for working together in a very short period of time to ensure that we could achieve bipartisan consensus on this bill. I also want to take the time to thank the majority staff as well, Pam Whitney and Alan Lee, for their work. You know, we want to do the right thing for the health of our former and future astronauts, and I'm pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the Act to provide for monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment of former astronauts as well as management astronauts. Our astronauts are heroes. They serve this nation in the face of extreme risks, and some of those risks involve the potential for medical conditions that may not reveal themselves for years or even decades after their service. It is our responsibility to ensure that we, as a nation, acknowledge the risks that these heroes have taken, and in return, provide our astronauts with the medical monitoring and treatment they need. It's also our responsibility to mitigate the risks for future NASA explorers, especially as we set in place the systems and missions to prepare the way for human exploration of Mars. Such risk mitigation requires data about astronaut medical and psychological health. This amendment strengthens the base bill by enabling earlier initiation of the monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment program, ensuring the continued availability of astronaut healthcare surveillance, and providing for a study on any privacy or legal issues related to data sharing. Specifically, it reduces the time period from 90 days to 30 days for NASA's arrangement of required independent cost estimates, eliminates a timeline for delivery of the independent cost estimate, and reduces from 90 days to 30 days the time period before NASA can initiate the program after transmitting the cost estimate to this committee and to the Senate Commerce Committee. My amendment also ensures that former astronauts who do not elect to participate in the expanded monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment program under the Act will continue to have the opportunity to participate on a voluntary basis in the existing lifetime surveillance of astronaut health programs, a baseline monitoring and data collection activity. Mr. Chairman, as we expand the amount of data collected on former astronaut health, it's important that we place a priority on ensuring the privacy of the data. And this amendment directs the administrator to provide a report on any potential privacy or legal issues associated with sharing the data collected under this program beyond the federal government. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment offered by Representative Edwards represents a bipartisan solution that improves upon the introduced bill. It's a good amendment that ensures monitoring currently conducted under the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health Program is still available. It also directs NASA to report back to Congress on important questions related to the use of data collected under the program and the protection of privacy. I'm very glad that we can make this a bipartisan bill, and I strongly support this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote in favor.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Edwards. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Since there are no further amendments or reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 6076 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 6076 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 6076 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 6066, a bill to enforce federal cybersecurity responsibility and accountability. Be enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize the sponsor of the bill, Representative Ralph Abraham, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6066, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016, is a product of the good work conducted by this committee. The dozen or so hearings held by this Congress on federal cybersecurity issues have identified a need for H.R. 6066, a need further revealed by the work of other committees and entities as well. For example, on its cybersecurity issue summary, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, states, and I quote, "Federal agencies have significant weaknesses in information security controls that continue to threaten the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical information and information systems used to support their operations, assets, and personnel," end quote. Our committee has learned more about these weaknesses from hearings examining data breaches at the Office of Personnel Management, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. Additionally, a recent House Oversight and Government Reform Committee majority staff report on the 2015 OPM data breaches includes in its key findings that, and I quote again, OPM leadership failed to heed repeated recommendations from its Inspector General, failed to sufficiently respond to growing threats of sophisticated cyber attacks, and failed to prioritize resources for cybersecurity, end quote. This committee held 2 hearings in the aftermath of the OPM breaches, which highlighted the list of identified vulnerabilities that have not been addressed. H.R. 6066 takes an important step toward jumpstarting the conversation about the need for accountability, responsibility, and transparency in the federal government. Highlights of these bills include specifying and profiling the role of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the NIST director in regard to the development and establishment of federal cybersecurity standards and guidelines, directing NIST, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the Department of Homeland Security to develop the job description and responsibilities for an agency chief information security officer, requiring the annual agency to report OMB to include written certification by the agency head that NIST information security standards are being met by the agency, requiring each agency head to develop plans in consultation with the Comptroller General and separately with the agency IG to implement all of GAO's and the respective agency's IG's recommendations regarding information security controls relevant to the agency, and requiring an independent IG evaluation of each major cybersecurity incident experienced by the agency. Depending on the outcome of the evaluation, the OMB director is tasked with taking enforcement action that includes a recommendation to the president for the removal or demotion of the agency head, or ensuring the agency head does not receive any cash or pay awards or bonuses for a period of 1 year. The committee's jurisdiction over NIST allows it to modify the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. But the bill goes beyond addressing NIST standards and guidelines. It confronts the issues that must be addressed head-on if we in Congress are serious about endeavoring to provide remedies to the federal government's cybersecurity shortcomings. Its attempts to put the duty of responsibility on the shoulders of the agency head in a matter similar in principle to the requirements under the Sarbanes-Oakley law on a company CEO or CFO for certifying financial documents. This bill includes our committee's mark on a very important issue. It sets the tone for future cybersecurity discussions, particularly in the next session when the committee can build off our work today. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Abraham. We have one possible amendment that I'm aware of to this bill and to be offered by a colleague, and I'm just going to pause for a minute in case he is close by and going to offer the amendment. While we're pausing, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I'd like to move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to share one particular concern I had with this legislation, and that's the premise that somebody needs to get fired if the agency is hacked. I'd offer that this is probably not the best way to improve cybersecurity in the federal government or anywhere else. Imagine if it was the default action every time the private sector was hacked, which now seems like a daily occurrence. Just fire someone and it will all be fine. Companies would be in complete disarray. You know, I think the legislation, it's sort of weird. It says that the agency head has to personally certify FISMA compliance to Congress, when such a head is unlikely to be a cybersecurity expert. Agency heads have to be able to delegate. They have to be able to depend on the advice and the recommendations of the experts who report to them. My brother-in-law is the CIO at the Department of Commerce, and he is an expert, but I wouldn't expect Secretary Pritzker to have to certify what he has done or to be held responsible. You know, someone has to be held responsible when there are failures, or even worse, cover-ups or failures. But threatening to fire the head of the agency for every such failure would seem to be a poor way to improve FISMA implementation. We've had many hearings now on cybersecurity, and if we've learned one thing, is that good cybersecurity is very hard. Every time we make progress, the hackers develop something new. So the threats are constantly changing, as are the technologies and the best practices for detecting and responding to those threats. And not only that, but the law is constantly changing. We've amended FISMA twice in just the last 2 years. So perhaps a more productive way to improve cybersecurity at our agencies would be to provide more support, more funding for our agencies, give them the latest technology, let them hire the best people, so they're not constantly having to make trade-offs between cybersecurity and other important operational priorities. Another concern of mine is if talented people in the private sector are looking at this legislation and they see that our knee-jerk reaction is just to fire them if something goes wrong, inevitably things will go wrong. They're not going to want to come work for the federal government. So whether it's the CIO or the agency head, surely we want to attract the best people, the best managers to dedicate some of their career to public service. So, Mr. Chair, I just worry about some of the unintended consequences of this legislation. And one more thing, what may be the epitome of recursiveness, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the chairman of the committee, dated September 20th to Honorable James B. Comey, the director of the FBI, where on the second page, I quote, "The committee is concerned that former Secretary Clinton's unusual server and network arrangements call for amendments to FISMA. In fact, the committee is considering an update to FISMA, the Cybersecurity Responsibility and Accountability Act of 2016, this week during a markup scheduled for September 21, 2016. So, Mr. Chair, I just suggest that you've been ahead of the game in considering the connection between Secretary Clinton's emails and this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Without objection, the letter would be made a part of the record. I'm surprised it's not already in the record, but we'll do so. And appreciated some of your suggestions as well. We certainly need to spend more money on research and in those other areas that you cited. We now will proceed with the amendment we have listed for this bill, and that will be offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall. And I understand that the gentleman wants to offer the amendment and then withdraw it?
That's correct.
Okay. The gentleman is recognized and to explain the amendment.
I thank the chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6066, offered by Mr. McCall of Texas, amendment number 132.
And without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cybersecurity, it goes without saying, is a national security issue. A principle that this bill, I think, underscores, which is why I support the bill's ultimate objectives. I do, however, have some concerns about how the bill might impact current cybersecurity law. Over the past several years, the House has worked to support and strengthen our federal cybersecurity by passing solid bipartisan bills like FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014, and the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 was passed last December. It was marked up out of my committee. Both of which were enthusiastically supported by both the Department of Homeland Security and the OMB. Unfortunately, this bill in its current form has raised concerns within DHS, NIST, and OMB that current roles and responsibilities, roles that are currently codified in law, might be disrupted in ways that are not optimal and certainly not intended, I think, by this bill. This bill is inconsistent with current law as the basic premise of my amendment, including legislation that, as I mentioned, passed out of the Homeland Security Committee, the House, the Senate, and signed into law by the President. It would also create duplication in government. With that in mind, though, Mr. Chairman, as we work so well together, also being from the same state, I'm offering an amendment that will safeguard the work we've already done to this point, while at the same time supporting NIST's valuable standard-setting role in cybersecurity. In fact, I hear all across the country the NIST standard is the gold standard of cyber security and cyber hygiene. The Department of Homeland Security is required to administer the implementation of agency information security policies and practices, while OMB sets the policy, and NIST provides the guidelines. This amendment helps to maintain the current roles of DHS and NIST and strengthen the working relationship between OMB, DHS, and NIST, while at the same time alleviating any concerns that these respective entities' roles and responsibilities might be inadvertently hamstrung or undermined. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McCall, for your comments. And do you withdraw the amendment as well?
Yes, I I believe we have a verbal agreement on this matter that we will
That is correct.
work together to go forward with this important legislation while at the same time
Right.
not changing or conflicting with existing law. And
That's correct.
with that verbal agreement, Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw.
Okay, thank you. I thank the gentleman from Texas and for withdrawing the amendment since it's not within our jurisdiction, but I do very much appreciate his interest in the cybersecurity issues and his perspective as chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security. Want to thank him again for his work and dedication to matters that we all care about, and I look forward to our two committees, plus the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, working together in the future to produce effective cybersecurity legislation we can all support. If there are no further amendments or reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 6066 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 6066 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 6066 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes without objection. So ordered. We will now proceed to the third and last bill, and pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 5829, the Advise Now Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5829, a bill to provide for the prompt establishment by the Science Advisory Board of the Environmental Protection Agency of the Agricultural Committee, being enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the agricultural...
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Molinar, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I also want to thank my Agriculture Committee colleague, Rodney Davis, for working diligently on this issue and sponsoring the bill before us. In February of 2014, the Farm Bill was signed into law. One section of that legislation directed the EPA to establish a standing agriculture-related committee that would be required to hear the concerns of the farmers across the country regarding the agency's rulemaking process. Farmers, including the 15,000 in my district, are some of America's best conservationists, and we should value their input when it comes to our country's environment and economy. The Advise Now Act accomplishes this and brings critical reforms to EPA's Science Advisory Board. Earlier this Congress, Chairman Smith, along with members of this committee, introduced the Science Advisory Board Reform Act, which would bring much-needed increase in transparency to the EPA. The House passed this bill last March by a vote of 236 to 181. This past June, I, along with 33 of my colleagues, including Agriculture Committee Chairman Conaway and Ranking Member Peterson, sent a bipartisan letter to EPA Administrator McCarthy expressing our frustration over EPA's inability to follow the law passed in 2014. Despite having more than 2 years to work out the details, the EPA has failed to establish a permanent panel to hear the concerns of farmers across America. In fact, the EPA has failed to keep Congress informed of its progress, which gives the appearance that the agency is willfully delaying implementation contrary to legislative intent. The Advise Now Act would ensure that farmers and the American people will have their voices heard, and there is accountability at the EPA. I encourage my colleagues to vote for passage of this bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar. Is there any further discussion on this bill?
Mr. Chairman.
If not, the gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just simply want to congratulate my colleague, Mr. Molinar, for rising to the occasion. As in all good pieces of legislation, such as the 2014 Farm Bill, nothing is ever completely perfect or seemingly in this town ever completely done, and everything requires refinement, improvement, and making sure that the various provisions and lofty goals are accomplished. You have taken a big step in that direction, your farmers and ranchers, and all farmers and ranchers should be very appreciative of that. Thank you, sir. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Spoken as a former chairman of the Ag Committee. And is there further discussion over here? If not, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 5829 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5829 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 5829 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes without objection, so ordered. That completes our business. I thank the members for their attendance and for their interest, and without objection, we stand adjourned.